So ladies and gentlemen, taking us to the end of day one at our conference today, navigating challenges for pension fund administration and benefit management as a consequence of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. It gives me pleasure now to call onto the stage Nicholas Fursley, Director General at the World Pensions Council. Nicholas, you are most welcome.
Thank you, Jeremy, and I'm delighted to join you guys. I know that I'm the last of the Mohicans standing between you and that delicious South African cocktail dinner, so I shall make it concise and wrap my thoughts not in an hour and 20 minutes as you see in the official agenda, but in a more concise way, so I'll convey my messages to you in 55 minutes max, so we can all enjoy that lovely cocktail dinner. Without further ado, I know that Jeremy reminded me that I shall stick to the timeline, so we're plunging into the presentation now. First, of course, I want to thank Jeremy, I want to thank Musa Mabesa, Baz Naidu, and Dondo Mogajane of the Government Employees Pension Fund for having invited me here today. I'm delighted to be here. I want to also thank Thérèse Couture from the World Bank Treasury Department. And I flew all the way from Paris, so I'm delighted all the more to be with you in Cape Town today. As you can see from the title of my presentation, it's a little different from what you see in the agenda because I've tried to incorporate recent news and I've tried to weave in some recent events or recent news which I believe personally will have a big impact on the way pension funds, sovereign funds, long-term asset owners allocate their money and manage their risks. So first, I'm based in Paris. The World Pensions Council, WPC, is a Paris-based international pension fund association, but it's mostly, I guess, a think tank. So we are bespectacled nerds, and we do research, and some of it is available on our website. I'm also the Director General of the Singapore Economic Forum, but my interns always remind me to give a disclaimer at the beginning, so I'm really speaking in my own, capacity here today, and the fact that I'm speaking, I'm sharing with you my personal views gives me more freedom, of course, to make critique and to insult people. So I'll speak more freely by saying that everything you hear today is a reflection of my personal biases and opinions. That being said, let me say, what I want to convey to you today are general trend and rough metrics. So it's difficult to convey that, using charts. So the data charts you will see today, they display approximate stats. It's not rocket science to the last decimal, but you have to focus on the order of magnitude. And why am I saying this? There's one particular data which is, annualized GDP growth in the past 11, 12 years. It's a bit problematic because, that period, which started, let's say in 2008-9 with the great financial crisis, until today, so that's 12, 13 years, is really abnormal in many ways. And in economics and finance, we love to normalize averages. And it's difficult to do it in the past 13 years because two big things happened, the great financial crisis and then the COVID crisis. So these figures, should be taken with a pinch of salt. Also because these are averages and there's inflation involved and, we're not always comparing apples and apples, and so I want to apologize in advance to my, Dutch and Danish colleagues in the room, and maybe the statistics that you will see for the annualized GDP growth for Holland for the past, 13 years isn't that low, but anyway, the graph is a rough visualization of a lot of information. Once again, I want to convey to you general metrics and long-term trends. And that's PowerPoint presentation is not for circulation. However, after the conference, I will circulate for those of you who want to learn more, some recent articles that we co-authored, which reflect some of the comments I'm going to make now. So I want to structure my talk around 7 things, and these 7 things or ideas are a reflection of the fact that we live in a dual age. So what does it mean, dual age? There's a tension between 2 things that are happening at the same time in finance, in economics, in policy making. So on the one hand, the world we live in is becoming more and more cynical. So more and more Machiavellian, brutal, cynical. But on the other hand, there's a lot of idealism. And ESG is one of the facets, or responsible investment, one of the reflections of that renewed idealism. And the 2 are happening at the same time, so it's difficult. Sometimes we're all lost because, how can the world become more cynical, more Machiavellian, and at the same time more idealistic? It's hard to comprehend, but that's how the way things are. So first, I'll borrow a quote from my Dutch colleague, Dr. Steenbeek, earlier today. So he said that it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. It's very true. But I'll still try to throw in a few predictions about the future. Then I'll speak about the power play. So that age of geoeconomics is in part, not only, but in part due to the fact that there is an accelerating Chinese-American rivalry. And it has an impact on everything around us, including financial markets. And I will argue that that impact will rise, will increase in the coming quarters, semesters, and years. And I will also argue that it will have a deeper impact than the Russian-American or Soviet-American rivalry of the Cold War. Then I'll say a few words about fiduciary capital or fiduciary capitalism. What does it mean? And why pension fund board members have it in their power to do a lot of things, a lot of good things for their country, for their people. And, to paraphrase Cifiso, they should be idealistic and do good things for the world, but their country's interest comes first, and the beneficiary's interest comes first. So, they always have to look at these multiple, balls at the same time, but when there is a conflict between, the larger good of humankind and, let's say, South African employees, of course, the interest of their members come first. Then we'll come back to geography. So there are other geopolitical, geoeconomic, geofinancial things happening, good and bad, and so we'll try to dig deeper. And I will argue that emerging markets, including African emerging markets, are being biased against. So the way indices, the way benchmarks are constructed is not favorable to Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and it's not good, and it should change. Then we'll touch upon a very important thing, and I'm delighted one more time to be here today because Regulation 28 was recently amended by the South African government, and I think it's great. It's great, it's sending the right message, so bravo, South Africa. And it's part of a trend, a larger trend of the rise of non-listed assets. So not only infrastructure, but also private equity, venture capital, real estate, etc., forestry, all that. And we'll say some words about that. I'll show you our matrix, so the private asset market matrix, which I had the honor of co-inventing 10 years ago, and which is now starting to be used by more and more policymakers and investors. And I'll make predictions about the next 4 years, so 2022, 2026, 4 or 5 years. Then we'll speak about ESG, impact investment, and the sustainable finance revolution. And last, I will throw at you 5 ideas. So the last point, the 5 policy recommendations, both for policy makers, but also for pension fund board members. So these ideas, or 5 themes, I co-authored with the Honorable Nick Cherry, who is the former Australian pensions minister. And so I'll explain, how we came to these 5 recommendations. So now about the past before the future, because the present, of course, is a direct consequence of the past. So we had 41 years of extreme neoliberal dominance. So in society, in culture, in policymaking, the ideas of what we call the Chicago School or the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, call it neoliberalism if you want, it worked quite well, actually. So it worked quite well for the past 41 years, but now it's starting to decline for many reasons. So I personally chose 4 items. So the first one is called the Glass-Steagall Act. So in finance, regulation and the law often has more influence than purely financial economic factors. So we are all fixated on discounting future cash flows and measuring risk of South African bonds or Moroccan equity. It's all nice, but in reality, the way the world really works, law and regulation has as big an impact, if not a bigger impact. And there was a law in America called the Glass-Steagall Act. And it's not a coincidence. The Glass-Steagall Act was passed after the 1929 great financial crash, right? And the reason why that bipartisan centrist piece of legislation was passed was really to avoid the next financial collapse. So many things went wrong in the 1920s and 30s, and lawmakers in Washington, D.C. wanted to avoid another big crash, so they came up with the Glass-Steagall Act. So it was about separating, on the one hand, investment banks and asset management companies on Wall Street in New York, and on the other hand, commercial banks, your mom and pop, your mom and pop bank down the street, which extends loans to households and companies, and really keep them separate. And that Glass-Steagall Act lasted for like 50 or 60 years. And then from the early 1980s onward, they started clipping the wings of the Glass-Steagall Act. And you could say President Reagan was a right-wing conservative, so it's normal that he started clipping the wings of the Glass-Steagall Act. But more surprisingly, those who destroyed and eviscerated that law were actually left-wing Democrats. So it's a cruel irony, but Clinton, President Bill Clinton, supposedly a progressive Democrat, he's the one who completely, eviscerated that piece of legislation, and he destroyed some of the barriers between, on the one hand, asset management, investment banking, and on the other hand, traditional commercial banking. And when you break down barriers, it's often a very bad idea because these barriers were here in the first place for a good reason. So why, am I making that digression? Because that wave, the neoliberal wave, was emulated the world over. So it started in Washington, D.C., then London, then the whole world, even left-wing and progressive political parties said, oh yeah, we want to be neoliberal. And so the whole world adopted these ideas, and sometimes they had the zeal of the convert. So they wanted to be more British than the Brits, or more American than the Americans, and we have that problem in Europe, for example, where we went all the way. So sometimes the French and the Germans became more neoliberal than Reagan and Thatcher because they thought it was cool or modern or whatever. And so the impact of that is financial markets became more and more short-termist. So the whole economy was financialized, and the stock exchange itself became more short-termist. Now we're living in a different phase. So it's hard to know what the future will look like, but that slow death, that very slow death of the Thatcherite neoliberal model started 3, 4, 5 years ago with things like Brexit or Trump. So all these things are symptoms. So I would argue that the election of Trump or Brexit are just a symptom of deeper economic, social currents that are happening now. And with the COVID crisis and with the war in Ukraine, perhaps now there's even an acceleration of the crisis. So a new world is being born in a way. We don't know exactly how it will look like. I'm just going to throw a few broad brush ideas at you. And before doing so, I'm going to recommend two books. So the one here, which is the most recent, was written 16, 17 years ago by a geoeconomics professor from Georgetown University in Washington. It's Professor Ludwig. And when he was published, most experts mocked him. So most of his colleagues, they said he's an imbecile, or he's cynical, or he's a cynical monster, or what have you, and he's a right-winger or a reactionary, because he was telling people things they didn't want to hear. Because, if the economy is growing very fast, if unemployment low, if the unemployment rate is low, everyone is happy, interest rates are low, people want to hear good news because they think that the world is rosy and beautiful. And 16, 17 years ago, Professor Ludwig said, no, very bad things are about to come in 10, 15 years. And of course, no one likes Cassandra, so they threw stones at Cassandra. And so he's the inventor of geoeconomics. So he coined the word. So 10 years before he wrote that book, or 15 years before, he invented the word geoeconomics. So he argued successfully that in the future, that separation we had between, on the one hand, the world of finance and financial markets, and on the other hand, the world of military strategy and policy making, all these neatly compartmentalized fields, all these separations would collapse. And in the future, in the 21st century, there would be a great convergence. So politicians, presidents, prime ministers, they would interfere in finance much more. Likewise, pension funds and big corporations, they would also be tempted to interfere in politics. So he saw a great convergence. And he is also one of the guys who invented a word that we hear a lot now because of what's happening in Ukraine. It's weaponization. So people are saying, oh, but Vladimir Putin is evil. He is weaponizing energy. And then the Russians are saying, oh, but the Americans are evil because the Americans and the European Commission, they are weaponizing trade, or they are weaponizing international banking. And both are true. So both statements are absolutely right. The Russians are weaponizing energy because actually who started the weaponization? It's the European Union and the US government who weaponized international finance and currencies and trade, but they would tell you, oh, but he invaded Ukraine. So it's a tit for tat thing, but the invasion of Ukraine is a fairly classic, it's bad, so don't get me wrong. I think it's really horrible what the Russians did in Ukraine, but I'm saying it's a fairly classic thing. So it's not the first country to be invaded, and when countries in Africa or Asia are invaded, when people in Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, Africa are massacred, very often the European Union or the US government does nothing at all. So there is clearly a double standard here. But this being said, the invasion of Ukraine is horrible, but what happened after is even more problematic. Weaponizing energy markets, weaponizing international law, weaponizing international finance is very dangerous. And I would say that both the Americans and the Russians are doing it. It's not good, but it was predicted to a large extent in that book that you guys should read, Turbo Capitalism, Winners and Losers in the Global Economy by Ed Ludwig. The other book I think you should read is a series of articles written in the 1940s and 50s by a French general who was a professor of management at Harvard Business School. And so General Georges Doriot is often known as the inventor of venture capitalism. So he's the father of what we call, modern private equity and venture capital. And the joke was, back in the 1950s, is he had three offices, one at the Pentagon, one at Harvard, and the third one in California, near San Francisco. He's one of the guys who literally invented the Silicon Valley. And why is it important to read the books of General Doriot? Because It's really the foundations of investing in non-listed assets. So he explains in a very great detail, and no one did a better job in the past 60 years, why is it interesting to invest in private equity and venture capital? Why is it risky? What are the kind of risks? Financial risk, but management risk, even more than finance. And who should or should not make that kind of investment, investing in early stage private equity and venture capital. And he explained that innovation, modern technological innovation, would only be achieved through that vehicle. And he was right, because many of the high-tech inventions that we use today, including smartphones, internet, etc., were actually funded initially by venture capital investments in the Silicon Valley. So this is just, I'm throwing at you a few images. So the first one is Tuco from the spaghetti Western movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And in a way, Tuco is the symbol of the cynical side of that new era we live in. So he's an extreme cynic. And once again, there is the duality. There is ultra-realism, cynicism, and it goes at the same time with idealism and ESG, and it's to a large extent driven by the accelerating Sino-American or Chinese-American rivalry on multiple planes. And you see it here because I think 6 weeks ago or 7 weeks ago, Antony Blinken, the US foreign minister or Secretary of State, he came here to South Africa, trying to convince the government of several things, and I think the South Africans received him politely, but basically they told him that they wanted to remain neutral, and so you will see more and more of that. You will see more and more American, European emissaries going where? Going to pivot nation, or pivot nation, and South Africa, Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia are pivotal nations. So in that accelerating Chinese-American rivalry, countries like South Africa will be courted by both sides, which is not a bad position to be in. So it's, the age of geoeconomics could be a good thing for you guys here in South Africa. And now a few words about, employee capitalism, trustees. Why are trustees, pension fund trustees, flexing their muscles? And why is it good? And why is their influence rising? So here, that old man here with money, it's the pension fund, right? And so pension funds can invest directly into listed, let's say, assets. So the champions and the factories, they symbolize, let's say, listed companies, blue chips. So one avenue is for them to buy directly, bonds and shares. And the I here, that I symbolizes governance. So they have to keep a watchful eye on these companies. They can do it directly, but there is the indirect route. And so many of you here are from the asset management community, so you would be here with a big brain. So you're here, and so sometimes pension funds not only buy directly bonds and shares, but they give mandates. So let's say, for example, if you're a big South African pension fund, maybe you know the local market very well, but maybe to invest in Japanese equity or Vietnamese bonds, you don't want to allocate too much time, so you'll give a mandate to a fund management specialist, and he in turn will buy shares and bonds. And if you look at the past 20, 30, 40 years, the proportion of assets owned collectively by pension funds the world over has risen. So you go to any country, Mexico, South Africa, China, Romania, the percentage of capital of listed and non-listed companies owned by pension funds and sovereign funds has increased dramatically. So I'm saying rhetorically that to a large extent they own the world. The biggest companies in the world, 40, 50, 60% of the capital now is in the hands of pension funds and sovereign funds. So of course, they have a huge impact on the world economy, and their board members, their trustees, have an equally important part to play because when they flex their fiduciary muscles, so when the trustees, flex their muscles and do their job and are fully engaged, then a lot of things can change. And so I think some people call it employee capitalism, or I like the expression employee capitalism, because it really puts the employees at the center, and the trustees are supposed to care for, protect the rights of, and represent employees on the boards. And now that's the graph. Once again, these are approximate figures, but I'm not sure it's big enough. But basically, on the x-axis, so here on that axis, you have the average approximative annualized economic growth in the past 12, 13 years. And so you can see that, here, maybe Holland and Denmark should be a little more to the right. So I have punished, arbitrarily Denmark and Holland, so they should be around here. But it gives you a broad brush, interesting view. So in the past 12, 13 years, countries like Australia, Canada, England, Britain, America have grown much faster, on average, annually, than Germany, France, Holland, or Denmark. The size of the national flag represents, symbolically, the total pension assets of each and every country, so the combined pension assets. And I have to warn you that I have had here on that graph, I've had to reduce dramatically the real size of the US flag. So basically, in reality, the size of pension assets here is much bigger, but if you increase the size of the US flag, it makes France and Germany even smaller. So what I'm coming at is some of these flags are big, so there are pension superpowers. So there's a huge percentage of world assets in the hands of pension funds from just 5 or 6 countries. If you take pension funds and sovereign funds from just 5 or 6 countries, they own 70 or 80% of the world's assets. So the concentration of wealth is becoming more and more acute. And who are these pension superpowers? America, of course, Canada, Australia, Britain, and Holland, of course. So now, after Brexit, the only pension superpower left in the European Union is actually Holland here. So if you put together America, Australia, Canada, Britain, Holland, and you can add to that Scandinavia, so you can put, Denmark and Sweden and Norway together, these countries represent alone, by themselves, 70, 75% plus of the world's assets. So why is it so? Because in some countries, like France, like Spain, Portugal, Italy, to a large extent, pension funds are still PAGO, pay-as-you-go pensions, social security style pensions. And that explains why the size of their assets is small, because in reality what they do, practically in real time, they take 6, 7, 8% of the pay slip of active workers, and they transfer them in real time to old-timers and retirees. Unlike you guys, here you have real pensions, which are invested over 35, 40, 45 years. Which explains that South Africa is actually, so sadly, there was a technical glitch, so there was the flag of South Africa here, but because of the Macintosh, Apple to IBM, whatever, conversion, it disappeared. But South Africa is actually not bad. You could say it's a large second tier, because I think the combined, so the size of the flag here is slightly bigger than Italy. So you guys are like 20% or 30% bigger than Italy, and you are here, so it's not a bad place to be. So I think, you have like 230 or 240 billion of pension assets, half of which are GEPF. So comparing you to other countries, you're actually quite good. So the position of the macroeconomic, financial position of South Africa, in spite of all the problems you guys have had, and people always complain, and things can always be better, but if you compare yourselves to your neighbors and to the rest of the world, you guys are doing actually quite well. I'm aware of time, so more geographic consideration. Yeah, so what I want to say is just pausing a little bit, and to avoid reading the bullet points, I'm going to try to do it by memory, which is better, with some coffee. So why was I saying before that there are biases? Because there is an oligopoly. So there are only 2 or 3 companies in the world who produce mainstream indices and benchmarks. And they are Anglo-American companies, and so their worldview is not good or bad, but it's very concentrated because it's a duopoly or quasi-monopoly. And to build these benchmarks, they focus a lot on listed assets. And they focus a lot on nominal GDP. So if you focus on listed assets, blue chips, and on nominal GDP, you will automatically, mechanically, favor countries like America, Japan, and Britain. And so if you look at most mainstream benchmarks, be they equity, stocks, or fixed income bonds, in a very biased way, in a very extreme way, they favor the London Stock Exchange, Wall Street, and the Nikkei index for historic reasons. And so now back to here. And I call them, old-fashioned benchmarks. And the main one is MSCI, but of course, there are 2 or 3 others. And what they do, they unwittingly favor liquid assets in rich, developed countries. So an example, if you take the MSCI World Index, as it is today, it would encourage asset owners to allocate 55% or more of their overall equity assets to the US market alone. And it would also encourage them to invest 8, 9, 10% of their overall equity assets to the Japanese market alone. So that's very extreme. If you look at other metrics, like purchasing power parity, or real GDP growth, or projected, so if you look at the future, so not the past, but the future, real GDP growth, demographic dynamism, etc., or just purchasing power parity, maybe perhaps people shouldn't invest 55% in the US, but 15, 20% in the US. Maybe people shouldn't invest 10% of their world equity holdings in Tokyo, but 3 or 4%. So there are other ways of viewing the world. And if you try to be creative and innovative and view the world with different lenses, well, what is the consequence? Then you would start allocating more to emerging markets. If you use more innovative, more rational, I will argue, benchmarks, you will invest more money in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. And so the emerging markets will get more capital. And it is starting to change. So thank God, the world is changing, and some sophisticated pension funds and sovereign funds are starting to move away from the traditional benchmarks and indices and creating new ways of investing, and they're raising their allocation to emerging markets, which is good. And once it happens more and more, much needed financial resources will flow from the Northern Hemisphere to emerging markets. Once again, I made that point earlier. Pivot nations in Africa, like Egypt, South Africa, in Asia, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Israel, they are benefiting from the Chinese-American rivalry because they're being courted by both parties. And what does it mean? So more and more, emerging markets will be solicited by both sides. Emerging markets will receive grants and loans and investment from both sides. So that's what I meant when I said that you guys are in a sweet spot, because you will be more and more solicited by both parties. It's not a bad position to be in. And also what I called pension superpowers. So these big Canadian, American, Scandinavian, Dutch, Australian, Singaporean pension funds and sovereign funds, they are also investing more and more in countries like South Africa, like Egypt, like Malaysia. So it's really, all the stars are aligned in a way. Now, a few words about the rise of private market assets. So this is a matrix which I co-authored 11 years ago with my colleague, Dr. Josh Frenzel, from the Washington, D.C.-based International City and Counties and Municipalities Association, ICMA. And what is that chart? So here on the x-axis, you have the overall percentage invested in private assets. So that's private equity, venture capital, private debt, infrastructure, real estate, and forestry. So all that is the x-axis. And on the y-axis, you have infrastructure alone. And so here, that red bubble is a Danish pension fund called PFA. But many of these big American pension funds I mentioned earlier, CalPERS, CalSTRS, etc., they would be here. So your typical big pension fund today allocates roughly 14–15% in private assets overall, and roughly 1.5 or 2% in infrastructure. So it's true that infrastructure is growing very fast, but it's growing very fast from a very low base, because you see here, it's 2%, 3%. So really, you have to imagine that most of the world looks like that red bubble. And I'm glad, we have in the room here someone from that very sophisticated and very large Dutch pension fund, APG, because they are not only big, but they're also a sophisticated asset owner. And we heard earlier today Dr. Steenbeek. And looking at APG, for example, I think they have roughly 18–19% in private market assets overall, and maybe 4 or 3.5% in infrastructure alone. That's the beige or brown dot. So that's a very sophisticated, large European pension fund. But then you have the world champions. So who are the world champions? They are the Canadian and Australian giants. But here, for example, the Caisse de dépôt du Québec, if you look at the chart here, I think they have roughly 34% in private assets and 10% in infrastructure. So it's already very impressive by any measure, by any standard. But believe it or not, there's even better. There's the Ontario Municipal Employees Retirement Scheme. They have 50% in non-listed assets and like 19–20% in infra alone. So when you're that big and that powerful and that influential, you can start doing great things. An example of that is the Montreal Tube, the Montreal Metro. The government, the provincial government of Quebec and the municipal government of Montreal, they came to them 9 years ago for money, said, okay, we're going to expand the tube or the metro. Can you dish out a few billion? And they said, the pension fund said, yeah, well, maybe that we want to redraw the train lines. So we want to completely restructure the way these new metro lines are going to be constructed. And you can only do that, of course, if you're big. So if you're really 200, 300, $4 billion big, then when you're investing in infrastructure, you can impose your own terms to your own government, which they did. So the scale of things is amazing. They own airports in France. They own high-speed rail in England. You name it. So ports, like all kinds of public transportation, energy. So now everyone is saying, oh, there is a global energy crisis and we must invest more in gas storage and oil storage. These guys have been investing in gas storage and pipelines for 30 years. So, it makes you more sophisticated. When you view the world that way, you are very often ahead of the curve. So the yellow arrow is our prediction, for what it's worth. So we're saying that in the next 4 to 5 years, there'll be an even more acceleration, a faster acceleration of the move towards private market assets. So the average, pension fund allocation to infrastructure, private equity, venture capital could easily double in the next 5 years. Once again, starting here, starting from the world as it is today, and the world today is more like that red bubble here. So ESG. So we've come a long way in the past 3 years. I'm going to read you verbatim a quote from Milton Friedman. So he's the father of the Chicago School of Economics. So he's really a very smart guy, brilliant economist. He's the father of what we call monetarism. And he's at the origin, he was an advisor to President Reagan and to Prime Minister Thatcher. So he's really the intellectual godfather of the neoliberal revolution. And he was saying, Milton Friedman, if anything is certain to destroy our free society, to undermine its foundation, it would be a widespread acceptance by management that social responsibilities, in some sense other than to make as much money as possible. This is a fundamentally subversive ideology. So he was saying, basically, Milton Friedman, that any CEO, any CFO, any board member of any company in the world speaking about society or the environment was a crypto-communist. So for him, the CEOs of the companies should be obsessed by only one thing: to maximize net profits every quarter, every semester, every year. Hence the whole stock option thing. Because the disciples of Friedman said, you know what, it's great. If you want to incentivize the CEOs of the big companies to maximize net profits every year, we're going to give them lots of stock options. So when your own salary and bonus is linked to that, you become more focused, and you focus only on that. So he was saying that, and to a large extent, his ideas triumphed, but now the world is changing. So that Milton Friedman worldview is less mainstream today, and for most CEOs, carbon pollution can no longer be just something external. They can no longer say, I don't care about pollution, I don't care about dumping chemicals in the river. That kind of attitude, socially, culturally, isn't accepted any longer. So the world is changing. And the COP21 Paris Summit in December 2015 was one of the turning points. So you could say that something happened in Paris 7 years ago that changed things. Another bigger turning point, I think, is in August 2019. So that's precisely 6-7 months before the start of the COVID crisis. So there's a very influential lobby called the Business Roundtable. It's basically a very closed club of the CEOs of the 100 biggest companies in America. So they met in Washington, D.C. in August 2018, and they wrote a statement. And back then, the Business Roundtable was presided over by Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan. And they said, you know what? Milton Friedman, neoliberalism, it's all good, but we should add something more. We can no longer every quarter focus only on net profit. Our shareholders, and the pension fund shareholders are telling us, we JP Morgan, we Morgan Stanley, we are partly owned by pension funds. They're telling us, you guys should care about the environment, workers' rights. And you know what? As a CEO, we have to listen to the pension funds or the sovereign funds. And so we're going to start incorporating ESG metrics in the way we measure our performance, blah, blah, blah. So that's recent. That was August 2019. That was just, 3 years ago. So that ESG revolution in reality is something quite recent. And so today, September 2022, that Milton Friedman, neoliberal stance has become unacceptable. So many people in Africa and Europe, if they meet a CEO who says, I only want to maximize short-term quarterly profit, they will show him the door. because it's no longer mainstream. So the mainstream has shifted, and there's a big demand across the boardrooms of listed and non-listed companies for the incorporation of ESG metrics. It's easier said than done, because as all of you know, measuring the environmental, social, governance quality of a company or of a manager is difficult. And the rating agencies themselves don't agree between themselves. So it's complicated, but even if it's complicated, the mere fact that people are putting money and time and intellectual energy into trying to grasp these concepts is good. So there are many ways you can do it. Let's take, for example, earlier today, I think it was Chairman Dondo Mogajani. He was using one ESG metric. He said, okay, blah, blah, blah. I want to know how many African people are in these kind of positions in big companies, or how many women. So you can use these metrics. So there are some metrics we can use to make sure that women are not discriminated against, or ethnic groups are well represented across all jobs and functions. But it's more complicated. So the ESG metrics are difficult to grasp, to measure. So there is something I love, which is the World Bank, the UN SDGs, the 17 SDGs. And I chose for you 3 out of 17. So it's arbitrary. It's my personal selection. Every company, every pension fund, every investor should do his own homework. So you don't need to follow my advice, but I encourage you, to really go through the 17 sustainable development goals and see how you can apply them to the way you invest and to the way you run your companies or portfolios. I think, climate action, gender equality, and life below water. So to me, these are really the top 3. Or, another one which you don't see here is actually infrastructure and innovation. And if you view the world through these ESG, SDG lenses, and if you try systematically to do so, it will, it takes time, it takes energy, but I think it will progressively change the way people invest. And if people invest differently, society itself changes. So now I will switch to the 5 recommendations. Once again, the 5 recommendations we drafted together with the Honorable Nick Cherry, who's the father of the Australian pension miracle. So these two countries, you see them here. The population of Australia and Canada is actually small, yet the size of these flags are huge. So in these countries, and also it's the case for Holland, the overall pension fund assets represents more than 200% of GDP, which is huge. If you look at South Africa, it's 35, 40% of GDP. If you look at France or Italy, it's 10 or 12% of GDP. So this is really creating distortions in the world economy. But if you are Canadian or Australian, it's great for you because you have a huge pension pot. And once you have a huge pension pot, there are a lot of things you can do, as we saw here with what these guys are doing. And so the guy who's really one of the 2 fathers of the Australian pension miracle is the Honorable Nick Cherry. So these 5 recommendations we came up with recently together. The first one is the following: ensuring the sovereignty of corporate and pension boards, so the trustees, when it comes to allocation decisions. Investment committees must always remain at arm's length from both the Human Resources Department or the CFO and the government. So that's really, really essential. Once the autonomy of trustees, once the freedom of trustees, once their fiduciary power is clipped, then a lot of bad things can happen. Of course, good trustees are also good citizens. So if you are a board member of a big pension fund in your own country, and you like your country, you will want to invest more in national energy transportation. Or you want to invest more money in innovative companies in your own country, right? So if you just create, and I think the minister said that earlier today, if you create the right environment, the right fiscal, legal, regulatory environment for your insurance companies, your banks, your pension funds, then there's no need, to push them, or there's no need to steer them. They will themselves invest domestically in non-listed assets. But they should keep their freedom of maneuver, their room for maneuver, their autonomy. That's very important. Then there's another thing which is crucial, is guarantee the sanctity of property rights and contract law. Because these assets, infrastructure, private equity, real estate, venture capital, are illiquid. So if something bad happens, or if something bad is going to happen, you can't just dump the shares. You cannot just sell the shares or sell the bonds, because to sell the asset would take you several months or several years. So if you're investing in illiquid long-term assets, you need the government at federal, national, provincial, municipal level to understand property rights are sacred, contract law is sacred. Once a government starts tampering a little bit with that, it's a disaster, because what happens is, what happens if one government does that, is that it completely changes the calculation of pension fund board members. So if trustees are burned once, they will not be burned twice. So if they have a bad experience in one particular province or country when they bought or sold a bridge or airport or port, you can be sure that for the next 50 years, they will never come back again to that country to invest in a highly illiquid asset. So really, the best thing any government can do is to ensure that laws are stable. Laws don't change every month or every year. Important laws are stable, because then the board members and the CIOs can make long-term calculations. You cannot make a long-term investment if in 5 years the law will change. It's impossible. Another thing we're recommending is adopting a pragmatic approach to energy transition and asset classification. And I really liked, once again, what Sifiso said earlier today, because he said, we're pragmatic, we like ESG, we like sustainable investment, but it doesn't mean liking ESG doesn't mean we're going to dump all our mining or natural gas assets, right? And I think it's very important to be pragmatic. So really having a balanced energy mix, having a balanced portfolio, diversify. Don't put all your eggs in the same basket. If you believe in ESG, it doesn't mean that you have to abandon all the financial wisdom that we have accumulated for 2,000 years. So diversifying is good. So investing in renewable energy shouldn't prevent you from also investing in natural gas assets or mining, right? So not being dogmatic, being pragmatic. And it's important for governments, so number 4, for governments to give visibility to investors, be they domestic or foreign, right? So if you want to attract money from Canadian or Singaporean pension funds into airports or highways or high-speed rails in South Africa, you have to give them a good visibility. So I love South Africa, I'm a South Africa file, but I'll make a small critique. So for example, here, there's only one high-speed rail. I think it's the Gauteng one connecting, the Johannesburg airport to downtown Johannesburg and Pretoria, and that's it. So when it was built, I think 15 or 16 years ago, there was a lot of enthusiasm because people were thinking that it was the beginning of an era where, Johannesburg would be connected to Cape Town by high-speed rail, etc. It didn't happen. Maybe one of the reasons why, you guys here didn't have a lot of investment into transportation infrastructure is maybe because the government didn't signal to domestic or foreign pension investors that, hey, we want to privatize part of the transportation, grid, and we have a 10-year or 15-year plan. It didn't happen because many crises many urgent crises, of course, happened in the past 15 years, so the government was busy elsewhere. But I mean, my point is, if you want to attract long-term capital, you have really to present to them some long-term avenues where they can put their money at use in your country. So I'm not saying that everything should be privatized, but if something are partially privatized or if concessions are granted, it should be made public and visible long in advance. And then there's something I'm quite happy about, which happened recently, so it's linked to the fifth recommendation, which is adjusting prudential regulation. So it's, the Basel and solvency rules. So, more and more in the past 25, 30 years, insurance companies, pension funds, banks have been shackled by these regulations which were invented in a small town in Switzerland called Basel. And we call it, Solvency 1, Solvency 2, Basel 1, Basel 2. I think it's really bad. So once again, my personal opinion that it's very rigid and very dogmatic. And even though I'm personally sort of center-left, so I'm more of a centrist or center-left, so I wouldn't vote for Liz Truss or for, in England or Britain, but I like one thing about her is, I think she won, the internal selection process. So she's been prime minister for just 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and she's very focused. And one of the things she's focusing on, I agree fully with, is she wants really to loosen the Basel and solvency rules, and I think she's right. And she's saying that she wants to do it because she wants to see pension funds. Remember, Britain is a pension fund superpower. So she wants to see British insurance companies and pension funds invest more in infrastructure, private equity, and venture capital. And I think she's absolutely right, even though I don't share her overall, political views. I think on that point, she's right. And I think on that point, in every country, you can have a national consensus of the left and the right. They can agree on some important issues. And I think, pension investment, long-term investment, infrastructure, innovation, private equity, employment, GDP growth are broad issues that can bring together the left and the conservatives and the center. So I think she's absolutely right. And the Europeans, the European Commission, they don't like her because by loosening, of course, by loosening these prudential rules or these macro prudential rules, by loosening them in London, in the City of London, she will make the City of London more competitive. So she will give more oxygen to British investment banks. She will give more leeways to UK pension fund board members and UK CIOs to invest more. And so in a way, she will make England or Britain more competitive vis-a-vis Germany and France. I'm French, but I try to be objective as much as I can. So I think, the Germans and the French don't like her very much because they fear that competition from the UK. And the French and the French government and the German government, they got attached to solvency and Basel. So they're afraid, they're afraid from, mingling or loosening these macro prudential regulations because a lot of laws, a lot of EU laws, national laws are linked to that. So if you start loosening, these insurance, pension, banking regulation, it's lots of work for, policymakers and the government. And perhaps, they don't want to go on that route because it's complicated. Reform is complicated. Risk-taking is not easy. But I think it's the right thing to do. So I think it's a very centrist, commonsensical thing to do because it's good for economic growth, it's good for innovation, it's good for long-term assets. And so I want to leave you here with a note of optimism. I think, once again, we can all agree that some things are good for our countries and we can surmount our left-wing political, divisions to focus on what really matters. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
No, we have to wrap up now.
Okay. happy because I'm also thirsty. So I'll hand you the floor. Voila.
Thank you, and don't forget your pens.
Yes, my collection. Cheers.
Okay. Nicholas, thank you very much indeed. It has been a long day today, and I'm going to call it a timeout as we end day one of the conference. A lot of interesting information are coming our way. We learnt about broad-braced economic empowerment. We confused Cape Town with Georgetown in Washington, D.C., so that kind of bookends the day for me. There was a lot of stuff in between as well. Ladies and gentlemen, 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, please, is a slightly later start. We do have our gala dinner tonight. I'm sure that you're all looking forward to that. Doors open from 6:30 this evening. I think things will get underway just a little bit after that. And if you're looking for that in this precinct, the conference center 2, hall 5, we're in hall 8 at the moment, hall 5, that is one floor down on the first floor. So I will end day one of the conference. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Good night to you.